In Syria, a group of teenage boys spray painted "Your turn next, Dr. Assad" on the wall of their school in response to the current protest. They were then held in police captivity for 45 days and were beaten, tortured, and starved. One of the boys, just 13 years old, was killed. During this time, protests raged on daily, at first peaceful, but within a few short days, President Bashar al Assad ordered his military to imprison and implement riot control, then resorting to deadly violence and killing many unarmed protesters. Assad decided that his regime would not follow after the mistakes of the Tunisian and Libyan government, thus choosing to silence the protesters before they gained any true power. However, he was too late as many had begun to deflect from the military and form the Free Syrian Army, the main rebel group. The Syrian civil war has incited the largest mass migration movement since World War II, and most migrants are fleeing to immediate neighboring countries of Jordan, Lebanon, and Turkey. As shown here in this map by Pew Research, despite many news reports claiming the mass has moved towards Europe, the majority of migrants have stayed within the Middle East. We will be analyzing the disparity of the humanitarian responses between Jordan and Saudi Arabia during this crisis. Saudi Arabia has not opened their borders to the migrants, while Jordan is host to 660,000 registered refugees, according to the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, UNHCR. Now, a key factor is to understand the current and previous relations between the two states and the Syrian government itself. According to the Middle East Policy Council, King Abdullah bin Abdulaziz was the first Arab leader to openly condemn the Assad regime and advocate for its overthrow. Saudi Arabia has directly helped to fund the Syrian rebels and provide them with military power and weapons. A major factor of this division is the history of Syria and its leaders. The Assad regime is comprised of a ruling elite Alawite sect of Shia Islam, despite 75% of their citizens belonging to the Sunni sect. Also, this regime is heavily aligned with Iran, the largest Shia nation in the Middle East, posing a threat to Saudi Arabia's dominance. On the other hand, Jordan has been very cautious to condemn the Assad regime or fully support the Syrian rebels, especially since Jordan shares a contiguous border with Syria. Historically, they have always remained peaceful and friendly. The pinnacle of this relationship could be observed in 1975 against Israel during the war. They are one of the only states who have currently refused to cut ties with the Syrian government during this time, as they balance out relations with the rebels who are in control of borderlands. Their main worry here is to prevent any spillover effects. However, there has been a trend of Jordanians favoring the rebels as they have allowed Saudi weapons to pass through their territory and have allowed U.S. troops to train rebels on Jordanian territory. Nonetheless, they have remained very cautious yet reluctant to cut its ties with the state, often acting as a buffer. As stated before, Jordan is a host to about 660,000 registered refugees. In addition to the refugee camps seen here, Zaatari and Azraq, Jordan has also undergone reintegration programs for the migrants. During an interview with a Jordanian official when discussing the safety and security provided by the Jordanian government, they were adamant in stating that the vetting processes have increased and that each individual crossing the border undergoes several checks. This may explain why Jordan has not been severely impacted security-wise by any one of the refugees directly. When asked about an increase in crime rates, the official said that there is no way to directly tie this increase to the refugees themselves, as crime rates have increased worldwide due to a multitude of issues such as drug smuggling. The camps also have their own police sector, in addition to schools and various sports, including taekwondo and other activities. Though they are allowed to leave the camps during the day to work, they do return thereafter unless they have filled out the proper paperwork to permanently leave. However, it is important to note that the Jordanian government does not force them to stay there, and they may choose to leave whenever. This is where many refugees bypass the paperwork and simply leave, thus missing part of the registration process. These camps are run by the United Nations, so despite some of their issues, they do meet the requirements and regulations. However, Jordan is facing several problems due to the massive influx. For example, a main issue stated by the official was the decrease in minimum wage in Jordan. Where native workers were being paid about 25 JDs, Syrians were doing the jobs just as well for about 5 to 7 JDs. To counteract this, the Jordanian government is practically giving out work permits to allow the migrants to work at the minimum wage legally. However, most transactions are done in cash, which are harder to track. Jordan is also the second water-poorest country in the world, something that has worsened due to the influx of refugees. Another major issue is that Jordan is not receiving enough aid. Many states pledge money but have not contributed to the full amounts promised. As seen through this pie chart, after taking a percentage and taxing the international aid, as they need to disperse some of that money towards border control and security intelligence, the rest of the money flows into the camps for necessities and its programs. However, due to unfulfilled pledges, the Jordanian government is being forced to pay for the gaps to keep things running smoothly. Yet they do not necessarily complain heavily of this and choose to handle it directly between the leaders, because the money that is being donated is still a large amount and they would rather have some help than none at all. Nonetheless, the attitude of the Jordanian government has always remained one of optimism. They believe that they are possibly the best for the job of hosting refugees. They argue that in some respects they are more stable than Saudi Arabia, as Saudi is in an awkward position with its own internal and international affairs. They currently face a huge issue with protecting their borders as they engage in various conflicts with their neighbors, such as the war in Yemen. Thus, the Jordanians assert that they are much more stable and are better secured to handle the refugees as they have been doing so since 1948, first with the Palestinians, then with the Lebanese, Iraqis, and more. In contrast, Saudi Arabia and the GCC in general has significantly hosted less migrants than other nations. There are three main reasons behind this fact. First, these states are not bound by any law to legally host any refugees. Second, the simple geography of both states poses a barrier, and lastly, Saudi Arabia feels as though their monetary donations are sufficient enough aid towards this cause. In 1951, the UNHCR met with states to discuss proper procedures for hosting refugees in times of need and how to care for them. Throughout the years, a total of 140 states have signed on the document that originally only 26 states authorized. However, none of the Gulf states have ever signed this document. Therefore, they are not required to report any official numbers of how many refugees they host, nor are they required to even host refugees. The alleged data and statistics that Saudi Arabia has provided in numerous reports from their state-sponsored news stations, the Saudi Press Agency, or SPA, are unreliable and extremely biased. Also, the numerous Gulf officials who have come out in support of their state, such as Dr. Khalid al-Dakhil or even Jamal Khashoggi, a former media aide and ambassador of Saudi Arabia, have continued to justify Saudi's lack of refugee policy due to the amount of aid being provided. Yet, in all of these articles, one thing is constant. Each reporter has direct ties to the government and the ruling family. The lack of non-biased information is a real issue as it allows Saudi Arabia to manipulate its data. Moreover, the Saudi government states that they do accept migrants, just not under refugee status, but rather migrant worker status, or those who obtain visas. They claim this helps to easily integrate them into society and helps to retain the dignity of these migrants. Saudi states that by allowing these migrants to work for their money and build their own equity, it will preserve their pride when everything else has been taken from them. Saudi officials and other outside sources also claim that the refugees do not want to live in camps anymore and seek a proper life with citizenship. The path to obtaining citizenship in Saudi Arabia is extremely complicated, expensive, and highly restricted. Also, to obtain a worker's permit, one must put down a lot of money, and it requires sponsorship and often giving up one's passport. Often, workers are subject to immediate deportation, denied financial support, and other rights afforded to recognized refugees. Geography also plays a huge factor in the number of refugees Saudi Arabia accepts, or lack thereof. The distance between Saudi Arabia and Syria is exactly 1,897.2 kilometers, or 1,179 miles. Jordan and Syria share an extremely long border and have always had a rather porous relationship along it. The distance it would take to get from Syria to Saudi is a rather long journey, especially since most of these trips would be taken on foot and through varying climates, and most without food, water, or guaranteed shelter or money. This is another reason why Saudi would rather send monetary support than host refugees in their own state. Another issue Saudi has claimed is the imbalance in their population demographics, as well as the cultural differences that refugees bring along with them. While the majority are Sunni Muslim and share the same religion as Saudis, their way of life is totally different. Saudi Arabia's culture is very strict and imposing. They have many fines and restrictions that are extremely different to the more relaxed culture of Syria and its immediate neighboring states. An example of this is how Saudi Arabia prohibited women from obtaining driver's licenses, therefore indirectly banning them from driving vehicles, whereas in more liberal states such as Jordan and even Syria, women are allowed such rights. It is partly for this reason as well that the United Nations does not have any camps set up in Saudi Arabia, as many of their laws and customs do not correspond with the rules and regulations set forth. However, Saudi Arabia has managed to preserve their strict cultural values and customs despite having enormous numbers of migrant workers from all different types of faith. These workers live in their own sections and follow the rules set forth by the government for the simple fact that they need the money and would not want to be fired and deported. This too is very similar for the refugees in Jordan, so why would it not be a similar situation for refugees living in Saudi, especially if they were to be granted worker status? As shown by this chart, Saudi Arabia is one of the highest donors to the displaced Syrians around the world. As previously stated, this aid goes towards providing the camps with necessities and supporting its programs. By paying these states to host the refugees, Saudi Arabia seemingly eliminates itself from being a possible host. As used as a basis in arguments by Saudi officials, they are directly helping and supporting the host countries in taking care of the needs and basic human rights of the refugees. However, it has been revealed by other leaders of host nations that Saudi Arabia often has not fulfilled the contracts and agreements between themselves and host nations. They have defaulted from a large percentage of their payments. They are the number one debtors in a long list of unfulfilled promises. However, there has not been a massive uproar over these broken agreements, as Saudi Arabia does continue to pay a percentage of their pledged amount. This is also true for many other states around the world. Nonetheless, it is not the full amount agreed upon, leaving the host states with much of the burden. Despite these excuses, Saudi Arabia should be playing a more proactive role in the crisis. Many of the perceived threats by Saudi Arabia are ones that can be managed with proper security and vetting operations, similar to those that have been initiated in Jordan. During this class, we learned about varying stability of states from Robert Rotberg and the state's capacity to provide political goods to its citizens in the reading of Neil Engelhardt. These writings are intertwined as they state various factors that can weaken states and the ability of states to disperse political goods to its citizens, thereby legitimizing the government and often stabilizing the state. Both readings provide quite accurate descriptions of the various issues seen today in much of the developing world. When applying these classifications to the current situation, one can conclude that Saudi Arabia is more capable of hosting refugees than its counterparts in Jordan and Lebanon, both of which have an infrastructure that was not prepared for such an influx of refugees, and though they are able to disperse the proper political goods to all of their people and the refugees, they are struggling, especially in the issue of maintaining clean fresh water. Also, when observing the fragile state index as seen here, the overall trend is that Jordan is worsening whereas Saudi is improving. The gap is widening. Saudi Arabia has one of the world's largest GDPs, ranked in the top 20 last year, as well as a total area of 830,000 square miles, much larger than all three of the main host nations combined, Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan. Their infrastructure is much more developed, and there are various areas that could serve as temporary camps for the refugees, such as the city of Mina. This city is a stop on the Hajj pilgrimage in Saudi Arabia. It is made up entirely of furnished tents with air conditioning and other commodities. This entire city is empty for almost 50 weeks out of the year. This is just one example of many where Saudi would be able to host refugees. Thus, the argument still stands. Saudi Arabia has the capacity to truly help these migrants in their current situation, and rather than come up with excuses, they should step up and become a host. If they truly do aspire to be a regional power, then they should act as one.